This is the second module in the leasing briefing series from Cisco Systems Capital. This module covers 3 topics: the relationship between the customer, the supplier, and Cisco Capital, the background mechanics involved in determining lease rates, and some of the options a customer will have once their agreement has started. When a customer buys a product or service from a supplier, the transaction is pretty simple. The supplier provides a product or a service to the customer, and the customer provides the supplier with cash, either straight away or within a brief period of time. This may be a check or some form of bank transfer. With leasing, one other player is introduced to the equation: the provider of lease finance, the lessor, which in this instance is Cisco Capital. Cisco Capital takes on a background role as supplier of the financing, but the transaction takes on a different form. The product or service still goes from the supplier to the customer, but this time the contract is between the customer and the lessor. This means that the payment for the transaction is in 2 parts. The lessor, Cisco Capital, pays the supplier pretty much straight away, normally within a couple of days or so, and the customer pays the lessor over the term of the lease agreement. In effect, this means that the supplier sells the product to the lessor, and the lessor, in turn, rents or sells it on to the customer. There are many different types of lease contract, but broadly speaking, they fall into 2 different categories: a lease rental agreement and a lease purchase or hire purchase agreement. The principal difference between these 2 types of agreement is that the customer ends up owning the product when using a lease purchase agreement, whereas Cisco Capital ends up owning the equipment when using a lease rental agreement. And principally thanks to better corporation tax treatment, the rate or cost of a lease rental is generally lower than that of a lease purchase. Because most customers don't see the merit in owning depreciating assets, and because the cost can be that much lower, most customers opt for lease rental agreements when choosing leasing alternatives over a cash purchase. And this last point can be summed up in the well-worn phrase: if it appreciates in value, then buy it; if it depreciates in value, then rent it. The second topic covered by this module is pricing a lease agreement. Calculating the customer's lease rate is usually determined by a number of variables. These include the cost and type of the product, the term of the agreement, the frequency with which repayments are paid, and the type of lease facility required. Typically, lease payments are calculated using a rate calculator, and lease rates are expressed as a value per £1,000 of product. First of all, the higher the cost of the asset, the lower the rate. Second, the longer the lease term, say 5 years rather than 3 or 4 years, the lower the rate. Third, the type of repayment profile, say quarterly rather than monthly, the lower the rate. And as explained earlier, lease rental agreements tend to be cheaper than lease purchase agreements. This information tends to be found on a single rate card or the Cisco Capital lease calculator. Ask your Cisco Capital representative for details so that you can calculate your customers' repayments should they inquire about a lease agreement. These standard rates are used in standard contracts, but lease rental agreements can, at times, be structured in different ways so as to accommodate a customer's budgetary constraints. Under certain conditions, the first rental payment can be deferred so that the equipment can be installed and used before payment has to commence. Or initial payments can be increased so that subsequent payments can be reduced. Or payments can start off low and increase during the term of the contract. These non-standard agreements do need to be formally approved before they can be offered to the customer, but they can provide valuable responses to what might otherwise be insurmountable obstacles to securing the sale. Once a lease agreement is up and running, it may run through to the conclusion of the full primary term, normally either 3, 4, or 5 years. This final anniversary, of course, creates an obvious opportunity for negotiating an upgrade or some other form of reworked solution. Quite often, though, customers will wish to add and upgrade parts of their solution before the end of the original lease term. If, during the primary period of the lease, the customer needs to upgrade certain products, then within certain guidelines this is a possibility. The monthly or quarterly premiums can stay the same, but to compensate for the increased cost, the term of the agreement is extended. But if the customer wants to terminate the agreement in its entirety before the end of the primary term, then full payment of all outstanding premiums will be required, albeit with some discount for early repayment. Finally, because customers rarely want to consider financing individual components of a system or network, our leases are able to accommodate all sorts of products, be that hardware or software and their associated services. And this gives the customer the simplicity of just a single periodic payment for a complete solution.